Please, just make it fast, the CEO said quietly. His voice carried no arrogance, no power, only exhaustion. He sat on the cold bench outside the hospital's intensive care unit, his expensive suit wrinkled, his tie loosened, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time in years, Adrian Cole, the man the business world called unstoppable, looked like a man who had lost his way. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly against the marble floor. Nurses hurried past, their footsteps echoing in the long corridor. Outside, rain pressed against the windows, whispering against the glass like a soft, steady heartbeat. Adrian's own heart, however, felt like it had forgotten how to beat normally. Inside that sterile room, his young son Ethan was fighting to breathe. He had built an empire brick by brick, company by company, yet now, in this quiet place where money meant nothing, all his wealth felt useless. He couldn't sign a contract to heal his child. He couldn't negotiate with fate. He could only wait. The nurse had just left him with a soft apology, saying they were doing all they could. And as Adrian buried his face in his hands, another man appeared at the end of the hallway. He wasn't dressed in a suit. He wore a simple shirt, his sleeves rolled up, grease stains on his hands, and an old jacket thrown over his shoulder. His name was Daniel. A mechanic. A single father. And though their lives could not have been more different, the universe had quietly been arranging this meeting for a long time. Daniel had come to the hospital not because he knew the CEO, but because his daughter Lily was recovering in the children's ward. A kind nurse had mentioned another child there, a boy who wouldn't stop crying for his father. And Daniel, who knew too well what loneliness looked like, had gone to comfort him. That boy was Ethan. And tonight, as Daniel walked down that long hallway, he saw the father behind the glass wall, a man drowning in silence. Adrian didn't even look up when Daniel sat beside him. The world around them was quiet except for the hum of machines and the distant rhythm of rain. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, almost like a mechanic talking to a broken engine he knew he could fix. He told Adrian that his daughter had once been sick too, that he'd spent nights here without sleep, listening to the same sounds, feeling the same helplessness. And though the CEO said nothing, something in him began to soften. It was not sympathy he heard. It was understanding. Adrian had always believed that emotions were distractions, that showing weakness made you lose control. He had lived his life by numbers, schedules, and results. But in this moment, all of that collapsed. He wasn't the CEO anymore. He was just a father. That night, Daniel stayed with him. Not because he had to, but because he remembered what it was like to need someone to just sit beside you in the dark. The hours passed slowly, the kind of hours that stretch and twist your soul. And when dawn finally touched the windows, Adrian whispered the same words again, but this time, they meant something different. Please, just make it fast. It was no longer a plea to the doctors. It was a prayer to life itself. 2 weeks earlier, Adrian Cole had been standing in his corner office, overlooking the city skyline that glittered beneath heavy clouds. He had everything: wealth, recognition, power, and yet, inside, there was nothing. Since his wife had passed away 3 years ago, his days had been a series of meetings, deadlines, and silence. He had thrown himself into work to outrun grief, but grief had longer legs. Every evening, he would return to a penthouse filled with shadows and unasked questions. Ethan, his son, tried to smile for him. But children see through things adults can't hide. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel's world was smaller, simpler, but filled with warmth. He ran a tiny auto repair shop, the kind where you could still smell the coffee more than the gasoline. He raised Lily on his own, teaching her not only how to fix a spark plug but also how to face life when it misfires. They didn't have much, but they had enough. And that was everything. Their paths crossed by accident one rainy morning when Adrian's car broke down on the bridge. No one stopped for him except Daniel. While Adrian stood under his umbrella, impatient and irritable, Daniel worked in the rain without a word, his hands moving like someone who had done this 1,000 times. In minutes, the engine came alive again. Adrian reached into his wallet, handed Daniel a $100 bill. Daniel smiled and handed back half. He said quietly that a fair job deserved a fair price, not more, not less. Adrian didn't know why that moment stayed with him. Maybe because it was the first honest interaction he'd had in years. Later that week, their paths crossed again, this time at the hospital, when both men were visiting their children. Ethan was lying in bed, pale and quiet, his mother's picture on the nightstand. Lily was sitting nearby, drawing rainbows and telling Ethan that he shouldn't be scared. Daniel was making them both laugh. When Adrian entered the room and saw his son smiling for the first time in months, he froze. Something inside him cracked open. Over the next few days, Adrian found himself visiting more often, lingering longer. He began to talk to Daniel. It started with polite nods, then questions, and eventually conversations that neither of them expected. They spoke about loss, about loneliness, about the strange way life tests you until you learn what truly matters. Daniel spoke of his wife leaving, of nights spent fixing cars until dawn just to afford medicine for Lily. Adrian listened. For the first time, he really listened. The two men became unlikely friends. The mechanic and the CEO. The dreamer and the realist. They couldn't have been more different, but they both carried the same kind of brokenness, the kind that doesn't show until you're quiet enough to hear it. Then, one night, Ethan's condition suddenly worsened. Machines beeped louder. Doctors rushed in. Adrian was told to wait outside. And that's where Daniel found him, shaking, pale, unable to breathe properly. Adrian whispered those words again, his voice breaking under their weight. "Please, just make it fast." But Daniel stayed beside him. He told him that sometimes, life doesn't need to be fixed, it just needs to be held together until it heals. And slowly, through the longest night of his life, Adrian began to understand. When morning came, the doctors emerged with a small smile. Ethan was stable. The danger had passed. Adrian exhaled like a man surfacing from deep water. Daniel stood up, placed his old jacket over Adrian's shoulders, and simply nodded. In that quiet act, something unspoken passed between them: respect, gratitude, and something deeper than both. Weeks turned into months. Ethan recovered, and Adrian started showing up at Daniel's garage after work. At first, he only watched, but soon, he started helping, awkwardly tightening bolts, asking questions, even sweeping the floor. It wasn't about learning mechanics. It was about remembering how to live without calculating every moment. Daniel's world, though small, was real. Every sound, every smile, every bit of grease on his hands, it was life in its purest form. Adrian began to change. He started spending more time with his son. He cooked breakfast instead of ordering room service. He listened to laughter in his home again. He stopped checking his phone every 2 minutes. He even began bringing Ethan and Lily together for playdates, watching them run through the park as if nothing in the world could ever go wrong again. One evening, as the sun sank behind the skyline, Lily tugged on Adrian's sleeve and said softly that he didn't look lonely anymore. He smiled and told her that her dad was very good at fixing things. She giggled and said that maybe her dad had fixed him too. Adrian looked across the park, where Daniel was wiping his hands on a rag, smiling at the sight of their children chasing fireflies. For a man who once measured success in profits, this right here felt like his first real victory. When he eventually returned to his office, his employees noticed the difference. He no longer barked orders or slammed doors. He listened. He changed company policies, introduced programs for single parents, created partnerships with small local businesses. His board questioned him. They said he was losing focus. Adrian only smiled. He said success means nothing if you forget what being human feels like. On the day of the company's anniversary, he left early. When his assistant asked where he was going, he said simply, to grab a coffee. Outside the building, leaning against a familiar old truck, stood Daniel, same jacket, same calm eyes. Adrian grinned, walked over, and said, "Coffee." Daniel nodded. And Adrian added with a smirk, "Just make it fast." Both men laughed. The same words that once carried pain now carried peace. The same hallway where they'd first met in silence was now replaced with the open air of a brighter life. The ruthless CEO and the single dad, two strangers who had lost so much, had found something priceless. Friendship, faith, and the quiet reminder that sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who know when to slow down. As the story closes, imagine the sound of rain fading away. The same rain that once fell on that cold hospital window now falls softly on the streets where two fathers walk side by side, their children laughing ahead of them. The world hasn't changed. But they have. Because sometimes, the people who fix engines are the same people who fix hearts. And sometimes, the words "just make it fast" are really a reminder to slow down and live.